As you scan the learning tech landscape right now, there's not a lot out there, and I would say most people are still doing this with duct tape, Elmer's glue, and paper clips.
Welcome to LearnOps Leadership Series. On this episode, we have Christopher Lin, Vice President and Chief Learning Officer of ChenMed, also the founder of Learning Tech Talks and Learning Sharks. And if you haven't joined that community, you definitely should. And Christopher, I know that you're also a father and recently had a new son. I read the post where you're still, you talked about the whole Mike Tyson battle and still we're coming up with a name. Do we have a name for your son yet?
We do have a name. So he is officially Barrett. We christened him Barrett Christopher. So we did have some people who said we should go with Tyson after the whole story, but we ended up going with Barrett.
Oh, this beautiful name. I too am a new father. Have a son named Levi, and his middle name is Alexander, the same as mine. So, something in common.
Right. See, my first has my middle name, and our sixth has my first name as the middle name. So we'll see what happens.
Well, thanks so much for doing this. I mean, LearnOps leadership is all about talking about the operational side of learning and development, as you know. It's not talked about enough in the industry. There's a lot of problems on the efficiency side of operating models within L&D. And, we've noticed at Synapse that a lot of the other business departments have this figured out. They have operating models. They have operating systems. For whatever reason, L&D is still, troubled about this. You're doing a webinar with us on building blocks of L&D, where you're talking about different L&D structures, efficiency, success, and data metrics. I mean, how did you even get into this? Tell us a little bit about your story.
So I originally, everybody thought I was going to be a, software engineer back in the day because I was into computers. Yeah. And I think back then they didn't really know all you could do with computers. So if you like computers, you must be a software engineer type of a thing. And it turns out it wasn't really a good fit for me. I didn't enjoy it. And I bounced around a little bit, ended up going into teaching because people thought, hey, you have a way with explaining technology and connecting the dots. You might be able to help shape the future generation. Sounded somewhat appealing. Realized academia was not a good fit for me because I really loved business operations and the way businesses operate and the way people are connected into that. And ultimately found my way into corporate L&D. But interestingly, and I think this ties to some of the operator side, I wasn't in the HR space. I was always in the business operations side of the house in different functions, different industries, things like that, because of my fascination with just understanding how the business ran. And so ultimately have worked in a number of organizations in an L&D capacity, albeit very different ways. And now I'm actually in HR for the first time ever.
That's really interesting. And what's your favorite part of it so far?
I think for me, the thing I enjoy most about it is the fact that no matter what happens with technology, automation, AI, all this stuff, companies still run on people. They still run on people. And I absolutely love bringing out the best in people. And I see that's what learning and development does. We bring out the best in people, but for a purpose, that purpose being one, their personal growth and development, but also optimizing the way the company functions. And so I think that blend has always been what really gets me going. And then the fact that technology just continues to accelerate and remove barriers. I often say you'll always find me at the intersection of people ops, business ops, and tech.
And how do you find that balance, right? On one end, as learning and development professionals, it's all about helping people. I mean, our mission at Synapse is to enable more people to learn and grow. And we do that by helping learning and development teams. But, but on the other side, corporate learning, you have a lot of business objectives to address as well. In your opinion, what's the right magic formula on how to balance the two?
When I get an answer, when I get a universal answer to that one, I'll let you know, because I'll probably be able to retire off that alone. I think realistically, though, I don't know that there is a perfect balance with it, because every organization I've been in, it's been a little bit different depending on what they were trying to accomplish or what the business was focused on, things like that. The maturity of the organization, I think every organization's in a different stage. And so to me, it's about, really getting the pulse of what is the organization, where are they at from a maturity standpoint, and where are their people at, and what do they really need. So, I don't know that there's a nice universal answer that if somebody was listening to going, man, I hope I can just execute against that. I don't know that you can find it. I think that to me is one of the things that makes our field so interesting, is that spectrum is constantly moving, and we have to be on top of it.
Never seen the market change so fast over the last few years, and just the momentum because of digital transformation and different operating models in a post-COVID world. It's really fascinating and interesting to watch everything right now. We hear more and more, especially in this post-COVID world, L&D teams talking about that it's hard to keep up with capacity, not enough resources, and we've heard mixed reviews about just being too much work, or actually working smarter, not harder, if that makes sense. And, in your opinion, what are some of the biggest operating challenges within L&D?
So like I don't think we're the only function that does this, but I think a lot of times it's easy to point fingers or make excuses as to, well, we can't, there's too many things we have to do. There's too many expectations on that. And a lot of times for me, it's been about, well, you have to prioritize. Everybody has the same 24 hours in a day. Every organization has, their own constraints. It's about working within those constraints. So for me, it's really been about, finding the right balance of what are the most important things. Because I think sometimes in learning and development, we tend to have an action bias, and we look at the work we do as kind of a quantity game versus a quality game. And I think that's a bit of a shift that as an industry we need to make, is how are we might, need to say no to things. And that's something that is not something we've always been really comfortable with as a function.
Yeah. I mean, it's hard if a VP in the company or, CFO comes to you and says, hey, we need this training or this learning. Mm-hmm. It's an awkward position, but, we're starting to see L&D teams act more like product management functions, where they partner, they consult with business areas to solve problems with learning solutions. In your opinion, are you seeing that shift? That shift's been around for a while. What do you think's next?
The shift has been needed for a long time. I think some organizations have done a better job of doing that. I agree with the statement of needing to move more towards a product development type model versus the academic model of, how do we build the library of opportunities for people, and more so saying, how do we identify what is the most important business constraint in front of us, and how do we rally our resources around that and focus on that. Now, I think where we're going, when we first started talking, this was back when we were talking about just the intake side of things, trying to do a better job of this front end, getting to the root of the problem. We talk about being outcome focused, but a lot of times we skip over that piece. So I think your point about this being the direction, the trajectory that we need to move on, I think is a good one. I think it's maybe a little overdue, but I think that's where we are now. Where I see us continuing to move, and this is where I'm pushing my teams, and hopefully I think the rest of the industry is going to get there, is becoming a little bit more predictive instead of reactive. And I think we've got to go through that better reactive stage. But, on the one end, there's just this, I'm just literally reacting to whatever is in front of me, and I'm just going off and kind of taking care of it. Then there's this more mature model of that, which is what we're talking about, where you're really getting to the root of what it is, focusing on the most important things. I think hopefully if we do this well, and I think this is where technology is helping us be more efficient and effective, is actually start to look at what's happening and make our predictions before they actually happen and we're reacting to them. But again, that's in many regards aspirational and there's a lot of work to be done to get there.
It makes sense. So what type of steps forward has your team been taking at ChenMed to try and accomplish these things?
Two of the biggest things that I would say have been, I call them the caterpillar movements that we've made primarily. And the reason I use that analogy is, you said this earlier when we first started, or maybe it was backstage, that sometimes operations isn't always the cool, fancy part of the thing that everybody looks at and goes, wow, I really want to focus my attention there. But without getting that in order, all this other stuff we're talking about doesn't happen. So really two big areas of focus for me, and I'll be talking about it in more detail on the webinar. One is the org structure, the actual need to reconstruct the way learning and development is structured to be able to operate this way. The way we've historically been built has been more of I would compare it to an academic model. You look at a university, we've in many ways modeled ourselves historically after that, where there's the college of this or the college of that, and within each of those colleges there's a full-blown thing, versus product management is a very different operational structure in the way you do that. So that's been a big part of it, is restructuring the team, specializing roles in certain areas based on what needs to be done. The second piece of it, though, is the actual operating model, the way in which we do business and the way things move through that, and the connections between all the different roles in that. So you could, in L&D, Addy, Sam, there's all these models that everybody refers to. I don't necessarily think the model necessarily is all that important. It's more the mindset and the way you execute it. But we moved to what we termed the double diamond model, which is a more agile, rapid kind of, let's rapidly assess what we do. Let's expand our thought, let's narrow it down, and then let's execute in a quick, iterative way. So our operating model, and then the structure to actually work with that, because that operating model wouldn't have worked in a historic L&D structure.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. I mean, the L&D function, it's nice to see the tailwinds now coming to fruition, and really coming to fruition, where people are actually talking about, we want to be more agile. I'm even hearing L&D leaders talk about scrums and stand-ups and estimates. And so the mindset shift is now starting to really happen. Whereas before, when we talked a lot about Addy or Sam, although Sam's meant to be more agile, it was still a framework that was kind of bottoms down versus, doesn't matter if it's bottoms down or top down, bottoms up. It's all about just iterating and learning along the way and working with your team collaboratively to be truly agile and to solve problems quickly. And so it reminds me a lot of where IT was 10 years ago.
Yes.
Nope, you only heard about waterfall. There was no agile. Nobody even heard the term of DevOps. And now we're starting to hear about LearnOps and learning operations, so it's really exciting. You're also talking a little bit about efficiency and success and data metrics on the webinar. What do you need to do or put in place to measure success in learning and to get the data and the metrics to demonstrate success?
One of the terms that I use, if you look at my LinkedIn profile, like my description, is kind of a digital first mindset. And to me, that's not just about the cool capabilities of technology, but also the data behind it. There's so much to be said about when you operate outside of this digital first way of operating. A lot of times you don't really know what's happening. You have your gut feels, you have your perceptions, you kind of know maybe some of these things, but there's nothing really quantitative that you can connect to say, just as an example, how long did it take us to go from initial request to delivery of something? You might have a project plan sitting on an Excel file somewhere. You may have some data points that tell you the dependencies in between it, but you don't necessarily know how did this process actually work? Where were the bottlenecks? Where did we hit the hurdles or the potholes along the way? And that's where moving into this digital way of operating actually allows us to capture a lot more of that capability. So I think that's a big part of it. And that's why I'm always looking at how can we use technology to enhance and even just run things so that we have the data underneath. Now, do we look at everything? No. Do we analyze everything and do we dig into all the details all the time? No, but at least we know it's there. That said, I think the other thing, and I think this is something that goes back to org structure. I talked a little bit about changing the overall org structure, but a big part of this is actually changing the talent set within the organization. I think a lot of times in L&D historically, it's been seen as just kind of this one size type thing. If you're a learning professional, you're a learning professional. That used to be a very singular definition of what you did, where realistically within learning and development, there is a wealth of skill sets and needs within that. So some of this is actually specializing in roles. So even as an example right now, I'm in the process of creating a role in my org specific to project management, where before you had a lot of people where, project management was part of your job or just an expectation. Well, a lot of people in learning and development don't like to be project managers, or it might not be the right skill set for what they're doing. If you're a designer, project management is probably the opposite of what you enjoy doing. And as a result, you probably don't do it very well or at all. And I think that's some of the really important pieces. As we specialize in L&D, we can say, hey, this is your job to make sure that this is executed effectively. And because they can specialize, they can do it well.
And are you seeing the role of project management in learning and development increasing in other organizations as well?
I would say it's not necessarily increasing. At least my perception has not been that the need has necessarily changed. The attention that it's gotten and the recognition of how important it is, I would say, is growing. Was that need always there? Yeah. Was that something that probably every learning and development professional would have said, yeah, project management is to some degree part of my job? But was it really something that L&D organizations said, this is a critical capability that we need to focus on and make sure we're doing? I don't know that that has been the case until more recently.
Mm-hmm. And do you see that role starting to tie into managing and measuring budget and impact of learning investments to objectives set out in advance?
Yes, in kind of a complicated way. So everybody, in my opinion, is contributing to those components in some regard. However, where I really see the project, at least in my shop and some of the companies that I've advised recently and how they're moving things, that role is very tightly tied to if you were to look at my organization, I have a part of the organization that's dedicated to project management and analytics and strategy. And the reason for that is those components actually span the whole portfolio of the product line. And I want those separate so that they can look at them objectively and be able to assess it. And so that's where I would say it's very closely tied to it, because they're capturing and managing a lot of data and process that then is tying back to the analytics team, which is allowing me to actually have dashboards, visibility into, okay, if this is what we're doing, I mean, that's a critical component. When I get asked, why do you need another head, or why do you need budget for this? If I can't articulate, well, it's because here's what we're doing and here's the data behind that, it's very hard. It's very hard to justify it. And so that's where I would say, yeah, it's absolutely tied to budget requests, but through my analytics team and through some of the storytelling they do.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, on one of the last episodes we had with Dr. Sydney Savion, her and I, we talked about why sometimes it's so hard for L&D to build the business case to buy new technology. And her perspective was because they don't have the data to build the business case. And so how are you putting together the data? What are some of the tricks and tips for the audience who might not be there yet from a maturity perspective? How do you go about thinking about how do we take a data-driven approach to our learning operations or to our operating model?
So I think it's a combination. So you'll hear the data side of it, I think starts with something we talked about earlier, which is far too often on the data side, we have a tendency, or it's easy to, and it's not just us, it's just easy to do this, to do a thing and then look at the data and then try and look back and reflect on, well, what might that have done type of a thing. And a lot of times that's how we approach business cases for a technology or something we're trying to do is we retroactively go back and say, okay, what did we do? What do we think we can tell? And how do we think we might be able to do it? And then we're busy trying to market and sell this concept that we've put together versus I would say the way I've done it and some of the things I've done right now is I do a lot of listening in the organization to try and listen to what are the pain points that the organization is going through? What are the major strategic directions that they want to take? And what do those actually look like? And what are the barriers that are inhibiting that? So instead of me going to them going, hey, I've got this really great learning solution. And look, I pulled all this analytics from our stuff that explains why I think it's really important. I've taken the time to get to know what are the pain points that you're dealing with. Then I use my analytics team to pull the data to help me tell that story, to show it in a quantitative way. Because you can say, oh, I heard onboarding's really bad. I think we need money for something to help with our onboarding. Well, that's different than saying, I heard you talk about how attrition is really high, 90-day retention is growing, and I've gone ahead and pulled what is the cost associated with that. It's costing us X per employee that we lose in those 90 days. Here ultimately is the cost to the organization that we're running into. However, with this kind of investment, we can actually mitigate this by X amount, and I think we can solve for that. That gets the attention of a business leader versus the other way around.
What would you recommend for people to even start to capture data for those who aren't doing it yet?
I tend to be more like, hey, before you just go try and build something from the ground up, scout out what else is in your organization. Because the reality is, very rarely are you going to encounter an organization that isn't capturing loads of data somewhere. You might not know about it. It might not be out of your shop. If you only have an LMS, you're probably not going to find a lot of data that's going to really help you tell a meaningful story. But somebody is somewhere. Your marketing teams might be, I'm sure your ops teams are, other counterparts in HR. There's a lot of people who are capturing this, and most organizations now have started building out their people analytics team. You should be able, before you go try and building stuff on your own, that would be my first advice is see what else is out there. Go talk to other people because you may end up duplicating work if you just try and go do this. Now, from there, I would say some of the other stuff is more operational. Can you clean up your house? Yes, absolutely. If you don't have clear processes in your own internal organization and you can't answer the question, how much time and resources do we spend on whatever the answer to that question is? That is a huge opportunity. And while that might not be as exciting as going and buying and implementing a new LXP, at least not in terms of popular in the industry, that's actually where you're going to get your start so that you can start justifying what's the utilization of my team, what's the time to delivery of our organization, things like that can start to help you justify what you might be able to do. And you don't have to do that in a super technical way to get started.
Great advice. Search from within, talk to the other teams. Don't just learn it on your own. There's people around you who you can learn from, most likely in your organization. And do that discovery before kind of setting out to that next step. Well, this has been really insightful. Last question would be technology. You host Learning Tech Talks. What are some of the most interesting technologies that you're seeing in L&D right now, and why are those interesting to you?
So this could be a conversation for an entire afternoon if we really wanted to have that. So I will try and limit it down. Now I would say, realistically, what you're doing with Synapse, I actually would say, while some might go, well, that's not like the cool, fancy, front end of stuff. It's like maybe not, but this is the stuff that it's like the plumbing in your house. If you don't get this stuff in order, you're not going to have running water. So no matter what you do, it really doesn't matter because you haven't cleaned this up. And so I think there are not a lot of players who are actually looking at how do we clean up our own internal operations. You scan the learning tech landscape right now, there's not a lot out there. And I would say most people are still doing this with duct tape, Elmer's glue, and paper clips. And that to me is one of the things that, again, that's why we originally started talking. I think there's tremendous value in cleaning up that operational side to be a more professional profession. So I think that's something that's interesting in the space. Good grief, I could go on for this for a long time. But again, I think, I'm seeing a lot of interesting things with immersive tech for simulation and the capability for real-time performance support. I think the age of anti-learning is coming on, where we're actually going to be able to start focusing not on what more can we put on people's plate, but what can we proactively remove from people's development, because it's not adding value, it's filler. I think adaptive technology is going to be, it is probably one of the biggest innovations from a end user development standpoint. Like I said, I could go on way too long than you probably want this episode to. Lots of really interesting things.
Yeah, so for more insights on learning technologies, tune in to Learning Tech Talks with Christopher. And to learn more about building blocks of L&D, tune in to our webinar that Synapse is hosting with Christopher, where we're talking about L&D structures, efficiency, success, and data metrics and operating models. Christopher, this was awesome. Thank you so much for your time. Always a pleasure talking to you, and hopefully we can do more of this to educate the industry more on learning operation models, the operating systems, and getting that plumbing in order to really see the efficiency and the effectiveness of the industry.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. It was a pleasure, Ryan. Always enjoy our conversations.
Thanks for tuning in to this series. For more information and content on LearnOps, please like, share, and subscribe. Visit getsynapse.com to learn more about our operations platform.